Hey there, this is Ross Izzard. This is the Backcountry Fly Fishing Podcast, where we talk about fly fishing in April. It is officially April, and that means that it's time for us to start thinking about real spring fly fishing in the backcountry. March is kind of spring, right? That's why we included an episode about March. It's very early spring. The early part is really more like winter. The end is more like spring, and it's kind of this weird tweener season, but I still lump it in with spring. April, though, is undeniably spring, and I think is an awful lot more fun to fish. It starts to look a lot more like warm weather summer fly fishing, which is my personal favorite thing. It brings the return of dry flies. It brings a whole lot more options for you in terms of how you fish. And best of all, it opens up places that you haven't been able to fish for like 6 months, which is pretty depressing. So April, to me, is like homecoming month, right? Homecoming in school is usually in the fall, but for me, homecoming is the dance that I have with the beautiful trout in April, because I haven't been able to get to them in my favorite streams for quite a long time, or even some of the lakes. And so it feels like coming home to me. April is the month where I really start getting excited. I start ramping up my fishing time because I have a little bit more time on the work front, but also just because it gets a whole lot more fun and I get to fish how I want to, where I want to. It's an awesome month, and it is sort of a really interesting month because it's a fairly temporary thing. You get some really incredible fishing in April and maybe the early part of May, and then you get runoff, and runoff blows up your favorite streams, at least out west, for at least a couple of months, sometimes a little bit longer, depending on how much snowpack there is and what the air temps look like. So it's this little window of incredible fun before things start getting kind of complicated. And today, we're going to talk about how to fly fish the backcountry in April. You probably recall that the March episode started out with me being a little bit grumpy. Some of that was because I was sort of fighting off a little bit of a chest cold and had this weird frog in my throat. So sorry you guys had to listen to that. Part of it is just because I have to talk about fishing tailwaters. The tailwaters are beautiful. There are plenty of nice ones out there. Sometimes I do hate them, but as a general rule, I don't hate them. But I don't like being stuck on them. I don't like feeling confined to those rivers, especially given the number of people who are on them and the amount of pressure that they see and the selectivity of the fish, which I know somebody out there says, well, they're so technical and that's why it makes me a great fisherman. I mean, maybe that's probably true, but I'm okay with being a middling fisherman, which I probably am, and just going to fish for more eager fish in other places, right? These fish in the tailwaters that have PhDs, and they got to have a size 24 purple zebra midge with a certain bead or this, that, or the other. I will catch those fish, but I'd be lying if I said that it doesn't irritate me sometimes, when really I'd rather be on a small creek, a freestone stream, fishing to brook trout or browns or rainbows or cutthroat who are going to eat what I throw at them. Within reason. I mean, obviously I got to be somewhat thoughtful about what I'm using, but they're eager and they're hungry and they're going to eat, which is what I want them to do because I want to catch fish, as opposed to the tailwater fish, which, I imagine them sitting down on the bottom of the river with their monocle on and like a little Groucho Marx mustache, evaluating every piece of food that floats by them. And even though I can appreciate the challenge of it, and I do think that it makes you a better and more technical fly fisher and a better angler, I could do without it all year. I don't, guys who fish that stuff all year, I just don't, that's not my thing. I want to get back out there. I want to get back to the backcountry. I want to get back to my Freestones. I want to get back to the small streams and the creeks on my 3-weight. April is when I finally get to do that, and it makes me really freaking happy. And I just want you to know that. I want you to hear that from me. It is beautiful because it signals the beginning of what I consider to be the proper fly fishing season. So why is that? Well, the biggest reason is because water temperatures are starting to come up. In the winter and the early spring, you're stuck on the tailwaters because you need water temperatures that are high enough to fish, which means, number one, the river's not frozen. Obviously, it's tough to fish frozen rivers. But number two, the water needs to be warm enough for the fish's metabolism to be functioning and for insects to be doing something. Once you get those temperatures that are super duper low, like low 30s, there's just not much going on. As a matter of fact, I went fishing the third week of March, and on my way to my eventual destination, which was a tailwater, I stopped at one of my favorite freestone creeks. And freestones are, as you all know at this point, streams that are free-flowing. They're not controlled by dams. They're not artificially managed. They're just normal, natural, beautiful rivers that are controlled by nothing other than what nature gives them, what water is coming into the system from snowmelt, from creeks, from tributaries, from springs, whatever. These are natural streams, natural waterways. I went to my favorite freestone in that area, and I hopped in just real briefly because I wanted to see what the water temperatures were. And in the third week of March, they were 33 degrees. Okay. 33 is not worth fishing. Anything below 36, I think, is probably pretty questionable. If you get down to 33, 34, 35, I would just go somewhere else, or maybe even go home. There's just nothing going on in water that's that cold. It's almost frozen. The bugs are doing nothing. The fish are doing nothing. You're not going to see much happen. And unfortunately, that's the case for most freestones for most of the early spring. That includes most of March, where even though it's starting to feel warmer, you might be walking around in t-shirts and shorts and whatever else, and the streams are ice-free. They look open. They look fine. And you might be tempted to think, oh man, my favorite freestone's open. It's not iced over. It's warm outside. It should be great. And you hop in there and you don't touch a fish for like 6 or 7 hours. That's because the water temperatures are still super cold. Water temps take longer to come up than air temps, obviously. It's harder to warm a glass of water than it is to warm a glass of air. I guess that doesn't really make sense, but you get my drift. It takes a while for those rivers to warm up. And usually they are not warm enough to fish until the beginning of April. And when I say warm enough to fish, I'm probably talking about 40 degrees plus. 40 is still pretty cold. That's on the cold side. But I would argue that until you get to about that daily average temperature of 40 or a little bit above that, like 45, these streams are in practice just not open. They're tough to fish. The fish aren't doing much. You're better off hanging on the tailwaters until you start seeing those average temperatures come up. Once you do see those temperatures start to approach and hit 40, so low 40s or mid 40s, then it's game on. And it is time for the return to the Freestones, which is what this episode's called. You can finally get back out to these creeks and streams and rivers that have been inaccessible to you probably since like October in the previous year, depending on elevation and other factors. And you can get back to fishing them. Now, choosing when this happens, so understanding when these rivers reopen to you, can be kind of tricky. The cheat sheet way to do it is to go onto the USGS website, or if your state has its own water monitoring system. So like Colorado has something called DWR that has its own stations that are separate from the USGS stations that will sometimes give you water temperatures. That's a great way to look at it without having to drive out and actually check them. You know, you can take a look at them. It'll show you, whenever you look at one of these water temperature graphs, you're going to see these big waves. And what that is you're seeing the peak water temperature at the peak of the warmth of the day when the sun has had a chance to really warm up the water. And then the bottom, the trough, is at night. It's the coldest that it gets. And what you're looking for is sort of the average between the two, right? So it's unrealistic to expect to be fishing at the highest possible temperature. It's also not going to be the case that you're fishing at the lowest possible temperature unless you're a crazy person and you're out there fly fishing in that kind of cold in the middle of the night, which I guess some people might do. You're looking for something in the middle, right? And so if you have daytime highs of like 40, probably it's still too cold for you to get out there. But if you have daytime highs of 43, 44, 45, and the average there is about 40, that stream might be open for business. And if you can find a station that gives you that water temperature readout, even if it's not for the stream you're going to. So, maybe it's for a stream that's only a couple miles away, or another stream that is similar and has similar flows and similar characteristics that you're familiar with. Those can give you an indication of what it looks like and what things are doing up there. And that can help you make a decision about when these freestones are open. Same thing for fishing reports. Obviously, you can go on and look at them. A lot of the rivers that I like to fish and the streams that I like to fish, by nature of the fact that they're in the middle of nowhere, don't have fishing reports, at least not detailed ones. You might be able to find a blog somewhere, but they're not reliable. You don't have guides out there every day who are taking water temps and reporting them. And so really outside of that, the only other way for you to know this is either to wait until you're sure they're open, which is probably the second week of April. And I think it's a reasonable guess in a normal year that most of those Freestones will have warmed up to an acceptable fishable level, or to go check them. All right. So if you have a couple extra minutes and you're driving by one of these streams on your way to a tailwater, do what I did. Pull over, pull out your meat thermometer, stick it in the water, take a water temp. It'll give you a sense of where it is. Same thing if you have a couple minutes and this is like, you're driving by a similar stream on your way to work or a meeting or to see your friends or whatever you happen to be doing, or you just want to take a drive. Go out there, take a water temperature reading. You'll look like a nerd, right? You're over there on the bank taking your water temperature reading and pushing your glasses up onto your nose, but it'll help you figure out when these streams are going to open, and that will help you start to plan your trips. Once you start seeing those water temperatures get into the 40s, then it's time to get back out there and start hitting these things. And this is a beautiful time because a lot of the lower elevation streams in particular, so these are streams that are below, let's say 8,000 feet. Most of the snow will have come off the banks by this point and will have come off the trails leading to these streams if they're hike-in streams. That means they're going to be a lot easier to access. So March, as you might have guessed from previous episodes, which is all about the toughness and the challenges of hiking on early spring trails, it can be a tough time to hike. You're dealing with snow, you're dealing with ice, you're dealing with pack, you're dealing with mud, and it's just kind of gross and it can be tricky. Usually by April, it's been warm enough, long enough at these lower elevations that that's starting to clear up. You're going to have clear trails. You might even have dry trails if you're really lucky here for a bit. And you can start to access these places again, right? So not only is it about the water being fishable as far as water temperatures and conditions, it's also about your ability to actually physically get there, whether that be parking in the parking lot or hiking in or however you're going to access it. Your world starts to open up. So as opposed to the relative handful of tailwaters that you've probably been fishing, now you have those if you really want to go back. I don't. I'd be perfectly happy to not touch a tailwater again until like November. But if you want to go back, you always can. But you also have this universe of opening up Freestones, which is amazing. And it dramatically expands your options when it comes to planning your trips because you can finally access them again. Now, I'm going to put a quick caveat here without beating the dead horse. You're still going to want to bring exo spikes for your boots because you're probably still going to run across slippery sections, especially in shaded areas or canyons. You may, at some elevations and in some places, depending on how far north you are and what your average temperatures are, you might still need snowshoes. So I don't want to give you the impression that it's, April and therefore everything's great. It's basically summer now. There are definitely still challenges involved with access, but you are able to access most things, and that's awesome. Just make sure you have the right gear with you. Now, once the water temperatures start coming up, two things happen. As you all know, by this stage, you might know anyway, but you definitely know from hearing me harp about it endlessly, trout are cold-blooded animals. Their metabolisms, and therefore their activity levels and their appetites, are determined in large part by the temperature of the water that they are sitting in. Really cold water slows their metabolisms down. They're not going to do much. They aren't going to expend much energy. They're going to sit on the bottom. They're going to hide in areas where there's very little current. And they might eat sometimes, but they're just kind of, they're not hungry. They're being kind of fussy. As the temperatures start coming up, those trout start waking up. They start getting hungrier, especially because they haven't probably been eating much for the winter, especially in Freestones. It's worth noting that tailwaters, because that water is dumping out of a lake, and because the water temperatures are so consistent, there's a lot of bug life in there. There might be like mysis shrimp, there might be scuds, there might be crustaceans in there. And then on top of that, you have this additional bug life. And therefore, those fish have a lot of food in front of them, even in the wintertime. That's part of why tailwater fish tend to be so big where they're not in other places. Food is just not as scarce for those fish. In the Freestones, which are the natural rivers where wild fish have to go and compete in a wild environment, for food, it's different. They may not have been eating like kings. They don't eat like kings even at the best of times, but they've definitely not been eating like kings in the wintertime, and that means they're probably hungry. So they're coming out of it. Fish lose weight, just like people lose weight, and they got to put the weight back on. They got to get out there and start hitting that food. Especially these Freestone wild trout, they do not have the option to be lazy because there's not a constant supply of food being flushed into the system for them. They got to get out there and they have to be opportunistic. So their metabolisms are starting to crank up. They know they need to get out there and eat. And so they're going to be hungry. And while that's happening, and they're going to go looking for food, which means they're going to start spreading out. We'll talk more about that here in a minute. But as that's happening, something even more important is happening at the same time, and that is that the bugs are starting to do stuff again. During the winter, you're nymphing, and the early spring for that matter. Almost everything that's going on is under the surface, right? You're talking about larvae, you're talking about maybe pupa if you're lucky, but probably just larvae bouncing around down there. And they're down there all the time. A lot of these larvae have lifespans that are measured in years, and so even if they're not hatching, they're still down there. They're still moving around, doing their thing, eating, getting washed through the current, getting eaten by fish. They're down there, but they're not really doing a lot. They're not hatching. Midges are hatching, and so you do have midge hatches over the winter. If you enjoy fishing size 26 Griffiths gnats that you need a telephoto lens to see, then cool. Maybe you've even been doing some dry fly fishing, but chances are you probably haven't. And now you're starting to see bugs that are beginning to actually hatch. And by hatch, I mean they're starting to move from their larval phase to their adult phase by going up to the surface of the water and actually hatching into the adult insect. Number one, that's cool because you get to see a whole bunch of bugs in life, and it's fun because we're all bug nerds, right? So it's fun to go out there and see these bugs doing their thing. I like to just watch them sometimes because I'm extra nerdy. But it also means that you now have a lot of options when it comes to how you fish. During the wintertime, going back to that sort of concept of conveyor belts that we've talked about before, where you've got a conveyor belt at the bottom of the river, you have one in the mid column, one right under the surface where those bugs are trying to break through the surface film, and then one on the top where the adults are once they hatch. Going back to that, in the winter and the early spring, you're really fishing just that bottom conveyor belt. You're trying to put your flies on that bottom conveyor so that it washes down in front of the fish and they don't have to move far and they eat it. Now, when the water temperatures start coming up in April, now you've got all the conveyor belts potentially open to you. So you don't just have to fish the larvae bouncing around on the riverbed. You can start fishing pupa who are starting to emerge through that mid column. You can start fishing emergers who are trying to break out of their shucks and come up through that film, that surface film on top of the water and hatch there, which is the trout's favorite thing to eat because those bugs are super vulnerable while they're trying to break their way out of that surface film, which for them is really, really hard work. And then you have the adults on the top where you're going to start seeing fish come up and actually eat adult insects on the surface, which means for the fly angler that now we can start talking about fishing dry flies and emerger patterns and other stuff, right? These have been pretty much out the window for most of the winter and most of the spring up to this point. But now all of a sudden you're starting to see stuff hatch. And you're going to have this kind of sequence of hatches. We're going to have an episode a little bit later this season all about spring fly tying and patterns. So I'm not going to go super duper into detail here, but we can talk a little bit about the hatches that you should expect. Okay. So by the end of March and the beginning of April, you're not just dealing with midges anymore. It's been all midges for months and months and months and months. And midges suck. They're tiny. They're not very fun. They're not super fun to tie. They're not very sexy. They do catch fish. So I fish midges because I have to, but midging is not my favorite thing. And they're certainly not my favorite bug out there. By the time you get to the end of March or the beginning of April, you're going to start seeing mayflies. Mayflies are sort of the traditional, most widely recognized trout bug out there in the world. You guys all know what they look like. They have these slender bodies with big eyes and long, slender tails, usually with a couple of little tails sticking out the end of those things. And then those big, beautiful sailboat wings that fold up over their backs. So when they're floating down the river in their adult form as the dun, they have these big wings that make them look like sailboats. And they're really beautiful insects, to be honest with you. It's kind of odd to describe a bug as beautiful, but mayflies really are. And the very first type of mayfly that you're going to start seeing emerging, at least out west, is going to be the blue wing olive, BWO. Now, we should mention that BWOs, it's kind of an interesting way to phrase that particular insect because it actually kind of isn't a particular insect. There are actually different types of BWOs that come in different sizes and slightly different colors and whatever. They're like, I don't know, thousands of species of mayflies probably. And we sort of lump them together into these, number one, the big bucket of mayflies generally, but then also into these sort of slightly smaller but still huge and overbroad buckets of things like the BWO. From your perspective, you don't need to know the Latin name. You don't need to go read about these things. I mean, if you want to, then cool, knock yourself out. I mean, it's cool to read about bugs. I've read whole books about them. because I'm so awesome. But all you need to know as a fly angler is that those BWOs are really small. These are not big mayflies. These are they're not the smallest mayfly. I think the tricos that you see a little bit later in the summer are probably the smallest mayfly, but BWOs are pretty small. These are not very big. And you can sort of use a number of different fly patterns to imitate them, but the most common one that you're probably going to see is an actual BWO pattern. These are super basic patterns. They can be tied in a whole bunch of different colors. They're usually tied in lighter colors, so pale green or white or something of that nature. And they're tied to float on the surface. They have their two little tails sticking out. That's the most common dry fly you're probably going to see to imitate these BWOs. That said, you can also imitate them with just a plain old parachute Adams. Okay, so a real small parachute Adams tied in 18-ish, maybe 20, probably about right for imitating the BWOs. And that is likely to be the very first dry fly, real dry fly, not counting the Griffiths gnat, which is terrible, that you get to tie on to your rig when the water temperatures start coming up and when you get back out to your favorite freestone. After you see the BWO start popping off, you're going to get the next thing, which is a slightly bigger version of the mayfly called the March Brown. These are slightly bigger mayflies. They, as the name would imply, tend to be a different color. They're not always brown, actually, interestingly enough, but some of them are. They're the next hatch. So you're going to start seeing the small BWOs. Then you're going to start seeing this sort of larger species of mayfly. And all of that to you probably means that you're looking for something between a 16 and a 20 in a mayfly imitation pattern. Maybe it is a blue wing olive pattern. Maybe it is a clink hammer if you're looking to imitate more of the emerging insect coming through that film. Maybe it's a parachute Adams. Maybe it's a very small royal wolf, whatever you want to use. There are different ways that you can imitate these things, but the point is that mayflies are going to be the very first thing that you see start popping off that's not a midge on these freestones once they start warming up to fishable levels. Very shortly thereafter, you're going to start seeing caddisfly hatches. I love caddis. Mayflies are cool. Like I said, they're the most widely recognized and the most traditional trout insect. These are the things that people get tattoos of, and you see, cutesy travel mugs and whatever of mayflies. And that's cool. They are pretty. Caddisflies are significantly less pretty. These are the ones that when they're flying, they actually look like little moths with their fluttering wings, and they have this sort of tent-shaped wing that lays down not entirely flat. It is kind of pointed like a tent across their back. Those are going to start popping off by the beginning of April. Out here in Colorado, there's a very famous caddisfly hatch called the Mother's Day caddis. It's kind of a stupid name because it has nothing to do with the timing of Mother's Day. Sometimes these things come out weeks before Mother's Day. But caddis are going to start popping off pretty quickly. And I find that even though the BWOs and those mayfly hatches will start to get the fish looking up at the surface, it's the caddisflies that really drive them nuts. I don't know why that is exactly, but I don't really start seeing really serious surface action until the caddis show up. Some of that I think is because of the way caddisflies hatch. So they come up through the water column pretty quickly, they break through the surface film, and then really quickly they take off. They don't sit on the surface like mayflies do. Mayflies sit there with those big elegant wings and they try to dry them out. So they just float for a while. And while they're floating, they're just completely vulnerable, right? Even the healthy ones, not just the cripples that didn't have a successful emergence and are kind of stuck. But these things are just floating around waiting to be eaten by a trout. Caddisflies don't do that. They come up, they hit the water surface, and they get the hell out of there as fast as they can. And that elicits this really violent reaction from the fish where they will chase these things up through the water column and they will explode out to get them on the surface. This is where you see fish that come almost all the way out of the water trying to get a fly of some kind. That's usually a caddisfly, and it's because the fish know that they only have a very brief moment to get in there and get after this caddis. That's really when I start seeing dry fly fishing heating up. That's when I get my signal that, hey, okay, we're coming back into it. It's dry fly season, baby, and I can start getting busy on that stuff. Caddisflies are the next thing to pop off, and they're really the signal to the beginning of, for me, dry dropper season. We'll talk more about that here in a second. You also have other insects that are coming off at this point. And as far as the caddisflies go, your best pattern for that, to be honest with you, there are a lot of different patterns for this, X caddis and a whole bunch of other stuff. But honestly, a good old-fashioned elk hair caddis tied in like a size 18 is going to do wonders for you. I tied these things up by the dozen. They're one of the few patterns that actually has 3 full rows in my dry fly box because I use them so often. It's very often the first fly that I tie on in my dry dropper setup in the warmer months. And they do great. They're super simple to tie. We're going to get more into this in the tying episode, but they are literally some thread on a hook with a little bit of dry fly hackle and some elk hair. That's it. That's the whole fly. I can probably tie a dozen of these in less than 10 minutes. I mean, they take almost no time once you know what you're doing with them. And they work great. So that's my go-to pattern. If you want to experiment with other patterns, knock yourself out. But man, that plain old elk hair caddis, it's money. And it's when you start seeing caddis popping off, you start seeing fish come flying out of the water trying to get them. Elk hair caddis is probably going to be the fly that I reach for in my box. But then you've also got stoneflies, right? So it's not just about the mayflies and the caddis, it's also about stoneflies. And you're going to have salmon flies and golden stoneflies and yellow sallies that start popping off in the summer months and are kind of seen as summer bugs, and especially later summer bugs. But there's some pretty significant stonefly activity even in the spring. These may not be as big as some of the really well-known stonefly hatches, like those huge salmon flies, but they're big enough that you can get away with fishing like a size 12 or 14 even chubby Chernobyl or a stimulator or something like that because they start popping off about the same time in April. And sometimes it's later in April. I'd say it's usually later in April that you start seeing this activity, but you will start seeing them. And stoneflies, for anybody who doesn't know, are a little bit different because even though the nymphal phase of the insect is underwater for a long time, like sometimes 2 years or even longer, they don't hatch the way that mayflies and caddisflies do, and that they don't rise up through the water column and hatch on the surface. They actually crawl out onto rocks on the bank. That's why they're called stoneflies. So later in the summer, you'll see a whole bunch of cases where they've actually climbed up onto the rocks, they break out of their nymphal case, and then they become the adult insect and they fly around and mate and do their thing that way. But just because they don't hatch in the water column doesn't mean that they don't make awesome dry flies, because stoneflies are terrible flyers. If you ever watch these things, you watch the mayflies and they're graceful and they twirl and they swirl and it's beautiful. Caddisflies, a little less so, but they still know what they're doing. They're like a sea-level pilot, right? They're the Frontier Airlines pilot of the insect world. No offense to anybody who flies Frontier. Stoneflies are bad. These are the guys that failed out of flight school. So they're super clumsy. They mess up all the time. They fall into the water. And then when they fall in the water, they're terrible swimmers. So once they're on the surface, they're kind of stuck. They can't get out of there. They can't fly off. And they're sitting targets for trout, which is a big problem for them because they are so damn juicy. I mean, these are big bugs that offer a lot of calories to a hungry trout. As I mentioned, these freestone trout, they're hungry. They want to get up there in April. They want to start eating. And if they see a big juicy stonefly on the surface, they're going to go after that stonefly. So this is a good time to be fishing kind of medium-sized stonefly dry patterns. And in fact, I will very often put on something that looks like a stonefly pattern as my dry fly in a dry dropper setup just to see if anything will come up. And if it doesn't work, I'll switch back to something smaller. I'll go back to the elk hair. I'll go back to a parachute Adams, whatever it happens to be. But I will often throw those on there, and very often they get eaten, to be honest with you. So don't forget about the stoneflies here on these April Freestones when you start getting back out to them. I should mention one more thing, which is that this is not terrestrial season. Not yet. There are some people who jump the gun on fishing hoppers and terrestrial patterns. And by that, I mean ants and beetles and grasshoppers and all of that kind of stuff. I'm not saying that it's impossible for you to have that kind of activity in April. It could happen. You could definitely catch some fish on some of those things. But I don't know that throwing a hippie stomper or a GFA hopper or any of those patterns that I like to fish otherwise in April is the best thing you could be doing. You really are better off focusing your dry fly attention and really all of the attention in your rig on your mayflies, your caddisflies, and your stoneflies. Terrestrials will come later. We're talking, June, July, August, September. But in this particular phase in April, you're better off sticking to those aquatic bugs. I think you're going to have better luck and you're going to see your catch rate go up by sticking to those. So that sort of covers the general bug activity that's going on in these freestones. The fish are waking up, they're hungry, the bugs are getting active. We've talked about what kind of bugs you can expect. Let's talk about where the fish are in this April stream, right? And so This really is when you start to see fish start behaving more like they would in the summer. They're not going to be sitting in those same winter lies at this point. So back in March, if you recall, there are a lot of cases where you can go out there and the fish are still hanging out in their winter lies. Even though the water temperatures are a little bit warmer, even though the air temps are warmer, they're still kind of hanging out in that deeper, slower stuff. You might have a handful that move up into the riffles and the pocket water, but for the most part, they're still hanging back. In April, that's not true. This is when the fish sort of leave those winter lies and spread out into what I consider to be the good stuff, the more interesting water to fish. That's not to say that you won't still find fish in pools and plunge pools and tail outs. You will. They're still there too sometimes. But they really do start moving up into the shallower water. So riffles, water along the banks, all the rest of that stuff. And the reason for that is that's where there's the most insect activity. So particularly riffles, that's where insects love to be when they hatch. You're going to see a lot more hatch activity over riffly water than you will over like a deep pool or a glide. And so the fish know that, and they move up into those places because they're the bug factories, and that's where they can eat the most. From your perspective as an angler, that means that you now are going to start shifting your focus from fishing those sort of wintry areas into fishing more of the classic pocket water and riffles and bank water. These fish will be up in fairly shallow stuff. So keep in mind that in April, runoff really hasn't started, at least not in earnest yet. The water levels are probably still fairly low. They're probably a little higher than they were in March. So the beginning of March is about as low as most of these water levels ever get. They're probably starting to come up a little bit as some of that snow melt starts making its way into the system. But they're still relatively low. And so you're going to find fish in pretty shallow water here. They might move up into a riffle that's only a foot deep. Or you might start catching them in bank water that's only 6 inches deep. And so don't ignore that sort of shallow water in the spring, because the fish will move up into it. And particularly with those lower water levels combined with that increased bug activity, you're going to find some fish that are in much shallower stuff than you might expect. And that's true sort of all the time, but it's particularly true in April. And so this is your chance to really get in there and start probing the riffles and the pocket water in particular. So throwing a dry dropper into riffles and along those seams is going to do wonders for you. Throwing it into pocket water, which is these sections of like rock gardens where you have big rocks or boulders that are blocking certain parts of the current, creating these little mini pools behind them and eddies behind them. The fish will start stacking up behind those. In the wintertime, those are largely devoid of life. There's just nothing really there. They're almost not worth fishing, in my opinion, in the colder months. But once you get into April, all of that's fair game. You pop a dry fly into one of those pockets behind a rock in a rock garden, you very well may have a fish come up and get it. You might have 2 or 3 fish come up and get it. Same thing with riffles. You're going to start seeing them move up and start being willing to come up and take a fly in those areas. And that means that your setup and how you fish is going to have to be different. You can still nymph, of course, if you really want to. You guys all know how I feel about nymphing. It's a have to and not a want to for me 99.9% of the time, really 100% of the time, for being honest. But, you're not going to be able to fish this shallower, different type of water effectively with most of your nymph setups. Now, you could probably Euro nymph it, don't get me wrong. You could conceivably indicator nymph it, although I think it would be pretty difficult unless you want to get hung up on the bottom every 5 seconds. You're going to want to be able to get in there and start working these shallower areas with dry flies. But you also don't want to neglect the nymphal activity. You may not be fishing as many larval patterns at this stage. You will have some that you can use as a dropper. But you're also going to want to be thinking about pupa patterns. You're going to want to be thinking about emerger patterns and other things that fish better higher in the column than the traditional nymph and larva patterns that you've been fishing all winter. And that means that you're going to be switching probably to a dry dropper. You can have a really good day fishing nothing but a dry fly. I've done that before. There is something classic and beautiful about fishing a single dry in an April stream. Nothing wrong with that, but I do think that you're going to do better with the dry dropper where you were able to pick up those fish who are looking for both adult insect on top and the emerger on top, and some type of bug activity or hatching activity in the middle of the column. And for me, that means a dry dropper. With some very rare exceptions, I like having a dropper on my dry flies because I do pick up a lot of fish on those droppers, and it is worth it to me to have those extra fish in my net. You can do you, obviously. But I want to talk a little bit about how I set up that dry dropper rig. So some of you will already be familiar with this based on what I talked about in the first season about fly fishing in the fall. You might have heard me talk a little bit about it in March, but I want to run through it again just to make sure that you kind of have it in your head. You can obviously do it your own way, but this is the way that I set it up. I will normally, at this stage of the year, be fishing a 3 or 4 weight rod. It might be a 9-foot rod, depending on how big the piece of water is. I really, really, really like fishing the Sage Dart. It is probably my favorite fly rod of all times. I love the thing. I love the way it casts. I love the way it feels. I love the balance of it, the weight of it. Everything about it is just beautiful. If I could fish nothing but the Dart, I probably would all the time. And it's a 7.5-foot rod, which works fine for bigger pieces of water, tends to be better suited to smaller pieces of water where you don't need that extra reach, but it does a great job for me. And so usually I'm on a 3 or 4 weight Sage Dart, or I'm on a 3 or 4 weight something else when I'm fishing in April. Obviously, I am using a standard weight forward floating line at this point. You can pick whatever kind of line you want. I've been through all of them. Fly line makes an enormous difference to your casting stroke and to how your rod behaves. So I really do encourage you to be thoughtful about which fly line you put on it. Most of my rods that I use in these smaller Freestones are lined with Rio Creek line. It's got a really heavy head, which allows the rod to load super quickly in confined spaces. That lets me limit my back cast, and it keeps me in the water more often and more accurately with my flies. That's kind of my go-to for typical Freestone creek fishing. But there's a lot of other good stuff out there, so I don't want to say that that's the only one you can use. But you should spend some time talking to the guys in your local fly shop, doing your research. Find a line that pairs well with your rod and that works for you. Do keep in mind that sometimes the line weight might be different than the rod weight, so I actually overline my Sage Darts in particular. The 3 weight has 4 weight line on it. The 4 weight has 5 weight line on it because I think that the rod loads a little bit better with heavier line. Some rods don't do well with that. And if you try to overline them, they're going to wind up casting like a wet noodle. You need true to weight line. But it really just comes down to what rod you're using and what feel you're looking for it as a caster. Every caster is different. Everybody has different preferences. Quick loading, fast shot, heavy weight forward heads for me are what I want on my small stream rods. That fly line runs down to my standard 4X tapered extruded leader. I don't tie my own leaders, as I've said 1,000 times before. I don't think it's necessary. I just run this thing straight down to there. It comes with a welded loop on the fly line in most cases, and then the leader itself comes with an already tied perfection loop. You just do a handshake knot right there and you run it down. At the end of that 9-foot 4X tapered leader, I tie a small 2mm tippet ring. Talked about tippet rings a million times. Maybe one day we'll do a full episode about tippet rings, but for now, in the interest of not beating a dead horse too severely, I use tippet rings all the time. I use them in the winter, I use them in the summer, I use them in the spring, I use them in the fall, because they're just so damn convenient. They stop you from having to tie surgeon's knots to connect your final terminal tippet to the tippet of the leader. They stop you from having to cut your leader back every time you change flies. They save you a bunch of money by making you able to use a leader for months instead of a few days or a couple weeks. And they just are convenient. They're awesome. They work well. They're perfect for tying on different lengths of tippets. They're just, the tippet rings are where it's at. So I tie the tippet section of that 9-foot 4X leader to the tippet ring with a single uni knot. And then on the other side of the tippet ring, I tie on my terminal tippet with a single Davy knot. If you don't know the Davy knot, you need to go and learn how to tie the Davy knot. The thing is tiny, so it's not a big heavy knot. It's super quick to tie once you figure it out. I mean, I can tie one of these in like 5 seconds flat. And it's incredibly strong. Now, is it as strong as a clinch knot or an improved clinch knot? I don't know. You could probably go look up the break strength. I bet they're pretty similar. Is it as strong as a uni knot? No, it's not. But it's pretty darn strong. And I have caught really large fish. I mean, we're talking 20 inches plus on relatively small rods, so 3 and 4 weight rods, on basically Davy knots, tied down to both the flies and to the tippet rings. They are more than strong enough to meet your needs on these Freestones in your dry dropper setup. So uni knot to the tippet ring, and then the Davy knot off the other side of the tippet ring, usually with 5X tippet. I'm a big believer in 5X. I actually think I could probably live the rest of my life with nothing but spools of 5X on my tippet. holder, there are people that use 4X for this and 5X for that and 7X for this, and that's fine. I will occasionally use 6X for really, really small flies, but I really only do that if I can't physically fit the tippet through the eye of the fly, because otherwise 5X is fine. It's the perfect balance between strength and subtlety, especially if you're using fluorocarbon. It's a little bit stronger than the mono versions. It's more abrasion resistant. It's a little bit harder to see in the water, supposedly. I don't know. I haven't tested that, and the fish haven't told me if they agree or not. But 5X does just fine. And the reason I tie that onto the tippet ring with a Davy knot and the main line or the main leader onto the tippet ring with a uni knot is because the Davy knot is weaker. And so that means when I inevitably hang up my rig in a tree or on a rock or a stump or a log or a person or whatever, when I yank on it, because I can't get the flies back, the Davy knot will break before the uni knot. And that's beautiful, because what happens then is I lose my flies and my terminal tippet, but I don't lose my leader or my tippet ring. So I don't have to retie any of that stuff. And so the result is that the leader stays intact. It doesn't get any shorter. I don't lose any of that, but I just have to retie my terminal tippet and the flies themselves. That's exactly what I want. And that's why I use a Davy knot there instead of another uni knot down to the terminal tippet. I run about 12 inches of tippet, maybe a little bit less, 10 inches or so down to the dry fly. And then I tie another Davy knot onto the bend of the dry fly, and I run that down to my nymph. The dry fly could be any one of the patterns I already mentioned. The nymph could be a whole lot of other things. Very often, though, it is a beadhead prince nymph. It might be a beadhead pheasant tail. It might be a caddis larva. It might be a caddis pupa. It could be a whole bunch of different things. But more often than not, it is a beadhead prince, because I just think that it does a great job of imitating just about everything that might be in the water column, especially the way that I tie it with Ross's super secret prints. But that does great for me. The beadhead really helps it sink down in the column faster, so it's not just riding in the film behind the dry fly, which is not what I want out of a dropper. I want it to fish a little deeper in the column. There are people who swear that messes up your drift. I don't think so. I'll go out and catch 30, 40, 50 fish using this rig. So if it's messing up the drift, then okay, but it's not affecting my catch rate, so I don't care. And I think the bead candidly gets eaten more often. I think that fish, for whatever reason, like eating shiny stuff. Doesn't really make a lot of sense evolutionarily. I'm sure there's a explanation out there somewhere, but they like eating beads, and I think the beadhead flies do better. So I'm running a Davy knot off of the bend of the hook of the dry fly, probably about 12 to 14 inches down the dropper. I will shorten that for really shallow stuff. So if I'm fishing water that's 8 inches deep, I probably will shorten that down to 8 or 10 inches, just so I'm not constantly hitting the bottom and getting hung up. And I tie that onto the final fly with yet another single Davy knot in 5X. And that's it. That's my setup. The beauty of dry dropper setups is that there's not a bunch of other stuff on your line. Nymphing comes with all this other stuff on your line. You have the big fly and the little fly, and then you have usually some split shot or maybe some split shot on the line, and then you have the indicator, and there's just a whole bunch of stuff on your line when you're nymphing. When you're fishing a dry dropper, there's really not. There's just the tippet and 2 flies, and that's it. And it's a beautiful thing. It's simple. It does great. You don't need to overcomplicate it. And that makes me really happy, right? Because it's just a simpler rig. It's easier to tie on. It's easier to re-rig if you lose your flies. And to be honest with you, it's just so damn effective that it's hard for me not to be excited about it. It just works so well. And if you can combine simplicity with efficacy, you just can't do better than that in any aspect of life, but especially in fly fishing. I mean, it just is, it's great. That is my setup when it comes to dry dropper fishing. And like I said earlier, I'm throwing that thing all over the place. I'm hitting bank water. I'm hitting all those seams along the banks. I'm throwing it into the pockets behind rocks and rock gardens. I'm putting it into the riffles. I might throw it into a couple of pools here or there, although I find that in general, dry droppers don't do very well in deeper, slower stuff. They do okay. Sometimes you'll get fish that are motivated to come up through 3 feet of water. But for the most part, I'm looking for that kind of medium to shallow depth stuff for this type of rig. I'm also not looking for super duper fast water here. Okay. So with the exception of some patterns, like really heavy foam patterns, dry flies don't do great in heavy white water. Okay. So even a particularly buoyant dry fly like an elk hair caddis that's been treated with gink or floatant, that is not going to do great in really, really heavy water. It's going to go under pretty quickly. That's not always a problem. Your dry flies will occasionally get eaten underwater. And in fact, sinking elk hair caddis and then twitching them through the water is one of my favorite strategies to catch cutthroat at high alpine lakes. So the fact that it sinks isn't necessarily a problem, except for the fact that in a lake, you can still see the fly after it sinks, and in a river, you can't, which means that if it's underwater, you don't have any way of knowing that a fish ate the fly. You don't have an indicator. You can't see the fly. You're probably not going to feel the take, and that means that you might miss some fish, and that's a bummer. So do keep in mind that even though you may fish the seams around that faster water and kind of up against it, you're probably not throwing these things into really heavy, broken water, and certainly not into white water, because it's not going to be very effective. You might catch fish, you just won't know that you caught any fish. And so you'll be relying on luck. And if you're relying on luck when you're fly fishing, you are officially doing it wrong, and you should do better. Now, if you're doing this right, you're probably going to start catching a lot of fish, particularly if you're hiking in and doing backcountry streams. These fish are going to be hungry and not probably super selective. Your catch rate's going to start going way, way up, which is cool. But knowing that, I would be remiss if I did not mention fish handling. We did talk about this way back in season 1. One of these days, we'll have a much deeper conversation about it. But fish handling matters, right? And especially if you're going to be catching a whole bunch of these wild fish, you don't want to be mistreating them, because we really don't want to be killing fish unnecessarily if you're doing catch and release fishing, which you really should be, to be honest with you, in most cases. Nothing wrong with keeping fish if it's legal, but unless you need to and you have a way to actually get them back to your truck, which might be 3, 4, 5 miles away, wherever it happens to be, without them going bad, you're probably going to be throwing them back. And to be honest with you, if you're hitting these streams and catching 30 fish in a day, you're probably not going to eat 30 fish in a day. And that means that at some point you're going to be releasing fish. That means you need to be paying attention to fish handling. Obviously, there's the basics like fish barbless hooks. Whenever you're tying your flies, crimp those barbs down. Or if you're buying your flies, crimp the barbs down. Just use your forceps or your pliers at home or your vise at home and just crimp those things down. It'll be better for the fish. You're not going to lose that many fish from having barbless flies. I know people act like you will, but you're really not. I promise. It's as long as you're keeping tension on that line. I'm not even totally convinced that the barb matters unless you're doing a really shitty job of fighting the fish. Keep tension on them. Keep that rod bent. You're not going to lose a fish just because your fly is debarbed. But the debarbed flies are going to do a lot less damage to those fish, and that's good, and that's what you want. So do debarb your flies. When you get the fish, you need to have a net with you. I think you all know that, but it's worth saying. And that net needs to have a rubberized net basket in it. It can't be fabric. It can't be rope. It can't be string. It can't be twine. It needs to have that smooth, rubberized net material in it, because that stuff is not going to rub the slime layer off of the fish. As anybody who's ever touched a trout knows, they're kind of slimy. That's why people get grossed out by it. They don't like touching them and they squeal and whatever. That slime layer is really important. It's not just because they live in the water and they're gross. It's there as sort of a protection for them against infectious materials and diseases in the water. If you rub that film off of them because you're wearing gloves or because you hold them up against your t-shirt or because you put them in a net that has really abrasive material that'll rub it off, or because you touch them with dry hands, and that's another thing, please always wet your hands before you touch a fish, okay? Or better yet, just touch them in the water, like reach underwater and touch the fish in your net there. Don't touch them with dry hands. But all of that is because if you rub off this slime layer, you make them susceptible to infection. It's like getting rid of their immune system. And this is how you get fish with like cottage hedge cheese and fungal infections and a whole bunch of other stuff. It's really, really bad for the fish. It's often fatal for the fish if you actually compromise their slime layer in a serious way. And it's not worth doing. So bring the right net. Don't touch them with gloves. Don't touch them with fabric. Wet your hands before you touch them. Do everything you can to keep that slime layer intact. And with that, don't hold them out in the air for a long period of time. I like taking pictures of my fish too. There's nothing wrong with taking fish pictures. Don't let anybody tell you that there's something wrong with taking fish pictures. Those are your memories. And if you're going to do catch and release, that is your sort of thing to keep from that day and that catch. Nothing wrong with that, but make sure that the fish are in the water until you're ready to take the picture. And when you do take the picture, that fish should be out of the water for no more than 5 seconds. If you can take it with them still in the water, with water coming over their gills, which you probably know this, but fish actually have to have moving water over their gills in order to be able to breathe. Trout do, at least. You need to do your best to make sure they're staying in the water. Don't pick them up and hold them out of the water for a minute. Don't pick them up and hold them out of the water for 30 seconds. Leave them in the water until you're ready for your picture, and then gently hold them up. Take a picture in preferably 2 seconds, maybe 5, then put them back in the water. If they're not in the water, they can't breathe. And keep in mind that these fish just got done fighting for their life. Okay, so they just had like this crazy battle. They think you're trying to kill them. That's what they think's going on. And they're fighting for their life. And by the time you net them, they are usually exhausted. Even if you're doing what you should be doing, which is playing fish quickly, you shouldn't be letting them run out and play for a minute or a minute and a half, especially smaller fish. You need to land them as quickly as possible to avoid exhausting them. But once they get in, they're going to be tired. They're going to be out of breath. And so, the analogy I've given before is imagine that you just went like 10 rounds with Mike Tyson fighting for your life. And at the end of it, somebody suddenly shoves your head underwater before you can catch your breath so you can't breathe. Probably not very pleasant, right? It's probably terribly stressful for them. And it can actually kill them because they have this huge oxygen deficit that they're now trying to make up and can't because you're holding them out of the water while you take your silly grip and grin. Don't do that. Keep the fish in the water until you're ready for the picture and then put them right back in there. Please be good to the fish, guys. There are more anglers out there now than I have ever seen before. If we don't treat the resource with respect, and if we don't do what we need to do to keep those fish populations healthy, then we're not going to have fly fishing anymore. So please don't be that guy. Be responsible with the fish. Treat them with respect as the animal that you are out there hunting, and get them back in the water as quickly as possible. Okay, if you can't get a picture safely without dropping them on the rocks, I should mention that too. Don't put fish on rocks. Don't put fish on sand. Don't put fish on anything dry. They live in the water. They don't want to touch dry things. So please don't drag them up on the rocks and take a picture on the ground with them. That's going to kill the fish. Even if they swim away strong, that fish is probably going to die. Please don't do that. Leave them in the water. Treat them right. And if you treat them right, then we're going to have fly fishing that we can share in these beautiful locations, especially backcountry locations, for many, many years with our kids and with our families and with the people that we love and the next generation of anglers. Treat them wrong and disrespect them, and we're going to find ourselves in a different place. And number one, it's ethically and morally questionable to mistreat an animal when you shouldn't and don't have to. But also from a just conservation perspective and from a sportsman perspective, it's going to lead to consequences for the sport that we don't need. So please be respectful. The other thing that I will mention is that in April, you're going to start seeing rainbow trout spawn and cutthroat trout, depending on what elevation you happen to be at. Browns and brook trout spawn in the fall. They're done and ready to do their thing. Their fry are probably already hatching by the time you get into April. But the rainbows and the cutthroats are starting to spawn. You're going to see their reds on the riverbed. These things look like perfectly clean sections in an otherwise dirty riverbed. Usually they look kind of, lighter and cleaner than the surrounding rocks. They're usually in relatively shallow areas where there's some water moving across it, where there can be oxygen coming to the eggs. You might see fish on them, you might not. But don't step on the reds and don't fish to the spawning fish. Okay, let the rainbows and the cutthroat do their thing. Let them spawn. They probably don't want to eat your flies anyway because they're thinking about making babies. And then do your best not to step on the babies, because stepping on one of those reds could kill hundreds of trout fry that otherwise would turn into beautiful wild fish for us to catch next season. So be on the lookout for that stuff, especially in April. Just do right. Think about it. You don't have to take a picture of every fish. You don't even have to land every fish. I mean, you can do the professional release and let some tension off that line. They'll pop that barbless hook out and swim off right away. But just be respectful out there, right? This is where the need for ethical angling and good conservation practices comes into play. I know you're all going to do the right thing, and I hope you're going to do the right thing while catching a whole bunch of fish in April on the Freestones that I know you have missed so very much. Maybe in the backcountry, maybe not. But either way, it's real fly fishing season again. And that's awesome. It really is. And I think that'll do it for today, guys. I could keep talking. There's so much to talk about. We will probably dig deeper into this topic at a later date. Certainly some of the aspects of this episode are going to have their own episodes even this season. But I hope that this gives you at least an idea of what to expect in April, where to fish, what you're doing, how to fish, what it looks like. And I hope it gives you the tools that you need to go out there and be successful as we finally get back into proper fly fishing season. Get out there, enjoy the warmer weather, enjoy those Freestones now that they're open again, do some hiking, get off in the woods, catch some fish, and I'll see you back here real soon. Till next time, this is Ross. And maybe I'll see you out there. But I hope not, because we'll all be back in the backcountry.